Hello,
We're back again.
here's Shabazz,
He's Pete Marshall.
and
And
what are we
today
talking about?
today we are talking about, well, I'll be asking Pete Marshall about something I learned about a week or two ago. Yeah, to my shame. Something called the double empathy theory or the empathy problem. And that could be my first question really. Which do you prefer, or which is the correct way of
We
framing it?
we have an autism episode today, so yes. Um, I think the paper it was originally put out in, it was double empathy problem, but honestly, that makes it sound a lot less kind of scientific. And to be fair, it is actually it's very scientific. So honestly, I guess double empathy. So it depends whether you want to sound pretentious or not, I guess.
Okay. Because because I might come across really ignorant in this episode, but I'm doing that deliberately in some ways because I want to learn about this rather than rather than anything else, and I think it would be good for the listeners to learn about this as well. Because, like I say, I only came across it in the last few weeks. So, just to begin, could you just give us a brief? Could you give me a brief uh, explanation of what you think it is?
Well, okay. Um, Double empathy problem. Essentially, this was come up with by Damien Milton, not more than about 10, 20 years ago now. And essentially, he is an autistic academic scholar of autism. Um, and this is why we love autistic academics of autism in the autistic community, because they come up with stuff like this. And essentially, what it means is it is the idea that autistic people don't have an empathy problem with each other and neurotypicals don't have an empathy problem with each other, question mark. But the problem that autistic people have is engaging with non-autistic people, and the problem with that neurotypicals have is engaging with autistic people. So basically this is a reworking. Normally there has traditionally been this idea that the problem autistic people have is engaging with people, and this very much goes with this broader notion that most people have empathy, and then we kind of take out people one by one who don't have empathy, and we just assume that they're just like that they are trapped in themselves in a sense. Whereas the double empathy problem by its very nature argues, well, no, actually the problem is that empathy is a kind of a structural issue, and so unless you understand what the barriers are and what the kind of structures are that creates empathy, then you don't then yeah.
All right. So I know, like, it's difficult when you talk about when people are talking about this stuff, because I know from a CP perspective, cerebral palsy, that as soon as people start talking about it, then you start talking about it, they start thinking about you as a spokesperson for the entire community, and I don't want to do that to you. But
I mean, I would just say in this, I have a degree in psychology and I've done bits of my master's. I got bored of
yeah,
that. But B, with it, kind of what I specialized around all of that was around autism, and we specifically did double empathy problem and things like that. So in many ways, I haven't actually done any explicitly new research on this. So if someone wants to start arguing that I'm not a scientist around this, I am not. I am, however, someone who has academic knowledge. So I'm not just kind of a random autistic person mouthing off about
yeah.
something that I haven't done any academic learning on. So
Yeah, that's an important thing to say, I think. But I just didn't want you to be asking you as a question that you're a spokesperson for the entire community, because I just don't think that's fair. But so I will be asking you about larger things, but I'll be predominantly asking about your perception and your experience, really. So, do do uh, what is your relationship with empathy then? Would you say?
I mean, I think in I'll go at this from a slightly different angle and say I think one of the interesting things around kind of the double empathy problem is in many ways it has the same relationship to the autistic community as kind of the social model does to the people with physical disabilities, because in some ways what the social model says is the social model says it's not you that has the problem, it's the world.
Yeah.
And in some ways that's exactly what the double empathy problem says. Traditionally, as I alluded to in my description, empathy is very much considered to be a human trait. And so, you know, if you go back, and this goes right back to the word autism, which originally goes back to Freudian notions, and it literally means like it was considered a form of schizophrenia that just means that you were like self-contained and you would spend your entire time like rocking in a corner or something. And this is, and you know, one of the main ideas around this was like, oh, empathy was one of the major issues, and like if you don't have empathy, then that means that like, you know, you can't reach out of your shell, and that means that blah blah blah. So this is so honestly, empathy, you know, in some ways it's interesting if you look at there's a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy written by Simon Baron-Cohen, and he's a specialist in autism. But basically, the entire book is talking about the differences between psychopaths, autistic people, and bipolar. I think bipolar. Anyway, so, and honestly, that's kind of part of the entire problem. That in some ways, it became that it's a really hard. The entire discussion around empathy is really hard because basically there's so much cross chatter around the entire thing, because I mean, you have psychopaths who don't have empathy, and then you're trying to go, yeah, I have problems with empathy, but I'm not going to try and kill you. And then you have various different other groups that have, and you know, most of the groups that have problems with empathy, there's like, you know, there's a whole series of like prejudices and blah blah blah. So I think that in that sense, double empathy problem kind of does two things. In the first, it kind of separates out, it kind of makes empathy a structural issue. And I think and I think it also makes it into like a broader philosophical issue that actually, like, whereas the past assumption has been that humans have empathy and only weird ones don't have empathy, this would argue that actually most people have problems with empathy to some groups. The question is what groups, and you know, if and yeah.
But so, is there any common misconceptions that really fucking annoy you that you would like to set straight around autism and empathy and that kind of thing?
I mean, the most intricate in some ways is around empathy and intelligence. And to be fair, this one is talked about in 0 Degrees of Empathy as well. Because generally there's this assumption that like intelligent people should be able to empathize, and more recently there's been this and more recently there's kind of the nerd caricature that like but in some ways it's basically intelligence does not kind of imply exceptional empathy, and honestly, exceptional empathy doesn't necessarily imply intelligence. These
Yeah.
um uh,
Sorry, could I just take you back to something you said about the nerd caricature?
hmm,
Because you were about to say something and then you didn't say it.
I mean um
You don't want to say it. Okay. Yeah. Uh, so so in terms of if you were to, like if you're talking to non-autistic people and you had to describe how you autistic people how you experience like empathy, how would you describe it?
I mean, in some ways, this is a problem because, in some ways, it's interesting. I was at a neurodiversity reading group. It's honestly the
Okay.
first one I've ever been to in my life. And one of the
Really?
yeah, and one of well, anyway,
Yeah.
I've done like a lot more informal stuff and blah blah blah. But this is the first kind of formal thing.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because honestly, one of the bigger issues that you consistently come up with is there's a problem with language because there's generally an assumption that um, empathy is a human trait. How many words are there associated with empathy? I would argue almost none. You know, if you think about almost all descriptions of that people have, they're almost always saying that one side was wrong or one side was right. Now, by
Yeah.
definition, if one side didn't empathize with the other side, who's wrong? Who's right? If neither side empathized with the other side, who's wrong? You
Yeah.
know, and this is kind of the problem that you get in these situations. That, and it's just a very autistic problem that it there's almost no words associated with this entire just thing. You know,
Yeah.
in the end, it's not so. Um, it's you have to start being incredibly like you have to start speaking in metaphors, and you have to start like, and honestly, generally most people have no do not want to get dragged into these kinds of discussions and do not care. And this is kind of one
Why?
of those. Excuse me.
Why don't they want to get this dragged
Um,
into this?
I mean, partly it's because, um, partly it's because people regard empathy as a human trait, and so as soon as you even imply that they're not having empathy, then they'll go, "Yes, I am.
Yeah.
I'm human. Like, what are you talking about? You're the weird one here." Um,
But
and
some people sorry. Go on.
and um, and the second thing is kind of as soon as um, is it become is it is almost is in terms of the there's the double empathy problem is kind of the beginning of a larger discussion, I think, about who we have empathy with, when and why. So for example, if you look at, there's some fascinating studies that were done on job interviews done by black versus white applicants. And actually it's interesting that that if you look at there was a whole bunch of extremely detailed psychological breakdowns, blah blah blah. They very detailed, and the actual way that the black applicants were being spoken to was different from the white applicants. Nevertheless, the people who were doing that did not actually recognize that as being racist, or like literally
No.
didn't even recognize them being different. But
Yeah.
obviously, in what way wasn't that a problem with empathy?
That
You
is a
know,
problem.
it's a problem with a whole bunch of things. But but
Yeah.
I would argue that that one of the elements of that was it was a problem with empathy.
Yeah.
So and so that's and this is kind of part of the thing that you all that that if that basically, if you want to imagine the dynamics, it's basically the same dynamics as if you call someone racist. But now they're about twice as confused, and you have a lot more difficulty because there's a lot fewer words, because you can't just call them racist. And
Yeah.
so basically it would go, if you want to use that metaphor, about as well as you would think it would go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah,
Because I don't think the government, for example, is very empathetic with the disabled community,
I
for
I think that
example.
that's an altogether more intricate discussion, because I think in some ways you're using empathy as a metaphor in that sentence, because the government by definition is not a person. Only people
Okay.
can have empathy with
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
With
yeah, yeah,
I can have empathy with you. I cannot have empathy
yeah,
with the
yeah,
human resources department. So
yeah, yeah.
so so
I see.
that's
I see what you're saying.
we're in a,
Okay.
given that we're in an academic environment, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Mm.
What I suppose I'm saying is the policies don't seem to reflect any kind of
I mean,
like nudges towards an empathetic uh, way of dealing with society.
one of the interesting questions here, actually, around policy is generally, if you the is generally the harder you push someone to have a certain amount of, let's say that you're talking about a salesman who has to make 2,000 sales in a day. Well, that if that's their target and they're going to get fired or they're going to get disciplined if they don't make that target, then honestly they're going to have a lot less empathy and are going to be a lot more driven towards that target than they are going to be thinking about, how do I be empathetic and kind to all the people I meet that day. And so I think this is highly relevant if you're talking about the benefit system, for example, or
Yeah,
the criminal justice system, or if you're if you want to encourage empathy in your staff, then honestly, to some degree, you have to give them time and space, and you have to make sure that they're comfortable. They're not going to get fired if they,
yeah,
if they're and managers have to make sure that each job has its, and so if you, and so part of this, I think, and so where this is, in the sense, this is a structural issue, or in a like policy issue, like
yeah,
we should accept the fact that the more kind of control managers give themselves, the less control people have about how they deal with each individual. And so there's not a lot of point in saying in saying that, I don't know, the benefits assessors are dickheads. Realistically, if they have targets to hit, then that's gonna, and managers they know they're going to get let off basically anything
yeah,
except hitting those targets. Then why wouldn't they be?
yeah,
And so this is part of the question that I think people don't like to accept, the fact that there are structural issues about when they're empathetic and when they're not. People are not equally empathetic to every person they meet in their day. And in the end, if we want to do things that encourage empathy, then part of what we have to do has got to be ensuring that working conditions for customer service workers, on whatever for whatever service or whatever, is actually such that encourages empathy, as apart from you say that you have targets to hit, and at the same time say that you're putting them through like sensitivity training. I
yeah.
mean, if your
Because
targets hit, you ain't sorry.
I would say it's doing at the moment the way services are accessed and stuff like that. I would say it's doing the opposite. It's dehumanizing the people that are making the decisions because it's all computer led and it's all point systems and all of that. So all of that sort of stuff doesn't allow for those employees who who even if some of them wanted to show empathy, it doesn't. The systems don't allow them to show empathy. Is what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
and part of this entire discussion, it has to it has to be acknowledged, is that there is only going to be is that functionally speaking, human beings like to justify their own behavior, especially repeated behavior.
Yeah.
And so to some degree there's little point in debating with benefits assessors whether they're empathetic or not, because they're going to say yes I am, and then if you give them 150 different examples of times they haven't been that empathetic, then they're going to just go, well, that person was asking for
Yeah.
it. There is, this is going to be there's no point. Human beings will come up with infinite bullshit responses and will just basically screw up the entire conversation unless you actually have a system which actually values empathy.
Yeah.
And then we can actually have a discussion, and then people can actually kind of question their own actions and blah blah blah.
I know we're going down a bit of a different alleyway here, but that's okay, I think. But one of the glaring examples of this to me is social workers. Yeah, to me,
Yeah.
more year on year, you get, because of the computer systems and because of the financial implications, that you're getting less and less, like, you know, for want of a better word, a sympathetic social worker, like, sorry, an empathetic social worker, because they're working within such tight parameters, they can't be themselves.
I mean, I think that there's an interesting discussion here. That I think if you look at the original social workers, so we're going back to the 1800s, late 1700s, then actually one of the interesting things about them is, in many ways, they were a slightly odd bunch, but in many ways they were kind of on the forefront of empathy. In many ways, they were doing something that no human being had ever really done, which was they learned about their poorer neighbors and actually tried to make they learned about what their day-to-day lives were like, and they actually talked to them about it. And some of what they did was talk about articles, some of what they did was there is put in place policies. Some of what they did was they went out and they for example helped people make their beds. They taught people how to cook. And so in some ways in some ways, if you look at the original thing, it was a revolution in empathy in some ways, because capitalism and history generally, they're one of the most significant, I would say, structural elements of empathy is you have more empathy for someone with more money and more power than you do for someone with less money and less power. If you honestly, it's fascinating. If you talk to almost any employer or employee, then they almost always have a lot more to say about how their boss feels than they do about how their employees feel, or how whoever they work with feels.
Yeah.
They're a lot more likely to go, oh, Joe Public, oh, they're such hard work. As apart from their boss, who literally works them harder, is nevertheless they're a lot more likely to be sympathetic to them. Why? Well, their boss has, money, power, blah blah blah. So in some ways I think that. So in some ways I think that any system that you have has, if you have social workers, then in some ways that was at the start fighting against fighting against human nature, in the sense that you were having people who were actually trying to empathize with people who were less powerful than them and had less money than them, largely. I mean, mostly the original social workers were middle class women who wanted to help society and help out their neighbors. there's an entire discussion about the ethics of that. But so I think that so I think it's worth pointing out that I think that's. But I think that honestly, you know, there was an article last week that was talking about social workers complaining about not having enough time, not having the money, not being able to do their jobs properly. Honestly, you know, my mum's a social worker. She has been complaining my entire life about not having time, not having money, not being able to do a job properly. I think in some ways, I don't think social workers would argue that they're proud of the job that they do, or that they think that they do their job to the best of their abilities in some ways. I think what you would probably find is that they would say, well, this is the best that can be done, which
Yeah.
in some ways is a more intricate discussion around that, and in terms of how to actually change the system is a much more intricate discussion.
Yeah.
But I think I think in some ways that's an interesting discussion once again on what I said about people self how people talk about empathy, that many people, when they talk about if they can't get out of a system that they need to act like that, then one of their justifications is it's the way it has to be done.
Yeah.
Or that's the way life is.
Yeah.
You know, this is, you know,
with it.
that's an excuse for not having empathy with with a person, for not having sympathy in a situation, which
Can I, at this point, can I just give further evidence of that? In my case, when I've asked a social worker for something and been fighting for something, they'll give you the example of Timothy or Jennifer down the road who's got far less than I have in terms of hours or whatever, you know. So in a weird way, they're asking empathy of you, in a way to understand their the decisions that they're having to make.
In some ways, the most fascinating thing about that, there is a bizarre film from the US. There's a bizarre film in the US that was made by evangelicals, so they're God Squaddy people.
Really?
And essentially, it's fascinating in the sense that if you look at, in the sense that there is two different types of people in this film. Very obviously, there is people who are blessed by God, and basically these people are rich. These people are basically immune to all consequences from the law, and I mean that literally. One of the characters is like a high-level drug dealer and doesn't end up getting away and doesn't end up going to jail. Most of his friends go to jail, he doesn't, and that's supposed to be a successful outcome and the actions of the Holy Spirit, apparently. And so, you know, you get the, and so this is part of, but basically, like, most of his gang goes to jail. And if you look even within the church, because part of this entire thing takes place in the church, and there is a very different way they talk about the priest versus the people who are like, versus the people who are handing out the hymns and stuff like that, you know. And if you and they like, so honestly I think in some ways I think this is part of the kind of the structured empathy, that if you're the poorer you are, the more you're expected to have empathy, and the richer you are, the less expected you are to have empathy. I mean, it's interesting. If you go into this Manchester program, 1 second, then there was this like person, then I can't remember what his name was off the top of my head. But basically in Manchester, he's doing these £2 billion worth of property development. And essentially there were these squatters in a house. Now this is now in this big building. Now he isn't doing anything with this. It's just sitting there. So it's not like they're trying to build around these people or whatever. There was literally nothing was happening in this place. But basically they spend but basically this guy, there's an entire scene where this guy is is getting really angry, and these people are just like, and he's just like, well, I bought that place, so I don't want them to be in there. So how come they're in there? And it's just like, and honestly, those people are homeless. Like there is zero empathy in this. There is none, and yet, like, and honestly, like, you know, he's not a complete dick to their face, but honestly, like, he says that to a camera that he knows is going to go out to the whole country. Like, and I think that there's an interest that, and there's an interesting thing. So the more powerful you are, the less you're expected to have empathy. And again, there's studies that people who've done psychopathic scores. And again, psychopathic, there's psychotic scales, which basically, the more psychotic you are, the more likely you are to demonstrate psychotic behavior. Shockingly enough, basically, and not have empathy, high to low. And basically, if you look at more powerful, more rich, blah blah blah, they're more likely to have high levels on the psychotic. Now, part of that is about kind of a survival of the fittest situation, where the more backstabbing and sneaking, conniving you are, the more likely you are to make it to the top, because other people are going to backstab you because you're doing it first. And you know, it's arguable how much that, you know, and it's arguable how much there's an element of this probably of who gets through the interviews is who is perfectly happy, you know.
Can you just stay in the middle first?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I just had a couple of questions for you in terms of, like, you know, now if this is really crude and it's really wrong, you can shout at me. But one of the example or the description I read by explaining this difference between neurotypicals and autistic people, right, was that if somebody was crying, like breaking down in the middle of the street, like a neurotypical would go up to them, try to console them, and an autistic person would in the same situation move away from them as if not to crowd them. Now, would that be a good way of describing it, or have I just?
I mean, I think that there are a whole series of discussions here. In some ways, like, I mean, okay, let's start here. In one sense, like, there's an element in this of if you're having empathy, and again, I could go anyway. If you're having empathy with someone, then you're kind of imagining how you would want them to respond. And in the end, many autistic people might, for example, not want to be hugged.
Yeah.
And especially if you're, and, you know, especially, you know, even me, if it was if it wasn't my, you know, unless it was my mum or someone, you know, I probably wouldn't want to be hugged in that situation. And
if somebody does, and if somebody does that to you, how does it feel? Does it
honestly,
feel suffocating?
Honestly, for me, it's my brain just stops.
Okay.
Really hard. Yeah. like it's a really high level skill being able to work through, like, someone touching you. Like, that's
okay. See, I'm not autistic, so I don't know. So forgive my ignorance.
So that's me. But there's a whole bunch of people who talk about it as being painful, as being rough. You know, there's a bunch of different descriptions again.
So for you, it's just a shutdown.
Yeah. So, which honestly, like, there's an entire discussion here about how would an autistic person want someone else to behave towards them if they were crying, because I think part of part of what I would critique in that is that if a neurotypical was crying, they probably would want someone to hug them.
Yeah.
Again, somewhat of a guess, but like, the odds are a lot higher. If you, I think another thing here is if you look at kind of sensory issues and how it affects you, because I think that there's because I think that there's a thing where for example, loud noises with autistic people tend to kind of cause them pain, myself for one. And I think that and I think that if someone was crying really loudly, then but that also affects kind of how they behave in some instances, and so yes, I think so. What I'm trying to edge towards is autistic people are less are under many circumstances less likely to act to elicit certain behaviors, but those behaviors are also behaviors that they're less likely to want.
Okay.
And so this is,
That's interesting.
And so I think that there's yeah, and then there's a third category here, which is which is kind of what body language you use to show what you want. Okay. I mean, one of the interesting things in my experience is autistic people, some autistic people have much flatter tone.
Yeah.
And I think that this, and again, this is partly about autistic people want you to listen to what they're saying, as apart from like saying it in the most exciting and fascinating way, and that is physically possible. And I think partly that's, and so I think, so there is an entire discussion here of when you just talk about crying. I mean, we know, for example, that there's about 8 or 9 different types of crying in babies, many more amongst like older human beings. So I think the language itself ends up creating an image which does not actually give an accurate representation, certainly of what an autistic person would be feeling or wanting, and honestly probably not what a neurotypical necessarily, but yeah.
Could I ask you, what would you say the autistic community's relationship is to the empathy theory?
I mean, in many ways, this is it is basically our version of the social model. It basically it is very it's empowering in a way that almost no academic theories are, because it demonstrates that we're not the problem, essentially, which
do you subscribe to it as a theory?
I think there's a fascinating, it's a fascinating start. I think that honestly there is.
Could you stay in the middle, please?
Sorry. Just for the record, I like spinning around on my chair, and it is and it doesn't help the mic, but yeah.
I'm trying to show empathy, but I want to hear what you're saying.
You don't need to hear what I'm saying. No. So yeah. So yeah. So double empathy. So
and its relationship to the autistic community is what I was asking you. And you were talking about the social model.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, so basically, so in that sense, it's very empowering, and I think that's part of the reason why it's so beloved. I think that in some ways it has much more of an impact in the autistic community than it has kind of outside of it. Honestly, it's quite odd. I was in, because because where I went to university, I was that was Reading, and honestly, I ended up doing various projects under two different professors. Actually, both of them doing very, very different. Came at this from very, very different angles. But honestly, like neither of them were that interested in it, and didn't. I have to say, I was just like,
Really?
I don't know. One of them, to be fair, was like a biocognitive person, and basically I
Okay.
ended up doing like a very, very like hard science project that I thought was interesting. Anyway, and it was very cognitive. So to be fair, I can imagine why he wasn't that interested. I was less certain why more of the social cognition person, who I also knew was not interested. I don't know why she wasn't, but you know that's
Uh, do, do you think it should be taught in schools?
honestly I think it should be taught in philosophy degrees. Like honestly, like to be honest with you, I would be more interested in like it. In some ways, I think philosophy degrees, like I want them to actually debate what it means to act that not all human beings have empathy all the time, and when and how is that impacted, that kind of thing. I think that would be. I think that if you want to talk about like genuinely interesting philosophy, that would be it. I mean, um, I think activists have a tendency to say that everything should be taught in schools, and I'm not sure everything can be taught in schools, and B, I think that like loads of things are just in life. So I think that it's more important that actually we as a society accept that when we treat workers like garbage, they're going to treat their customers like garbage.
Hmm.
You know, and in the end, you can tell people in schools that they shouldn't treat people like garbage. But in the end, if they're treated like garbage, then why would they think that that wasn't normal? So, you know, it yeah.
I just wondered. I wasn't, I wasn't doing the usual activist thing. I was just like just wondering whether you thought, well, that maybe is a good way to have it ground up. I think it's very interesting in the sense that it's so similar to the social model, as in like a load of people kind of uh, subscribe to it, and some people who don't, and
I
some
mean,
people who sit on the fence, and I
in
think it's
some
quite similar in that sense.
in some ways, I think that it's less similar in the sense that academics will very rarely say they don't believe it. What they will more
Okay,
commonly go is they don't think that it's relevant to certain things. Which
okay,
honestly is another very similar thing to the social model that many people go, yeah, I believe the social model is a thing, and then go, yeah, but it's not relevant to my psychological
yeah,
disorder or whatever. You know, it's not relevant to people breaking their legs. It's not relevant to like spina bifida or whatever. But
yeah,
it's not.
and
Um, but yeah, it's one of the things I will say is that I think that the biggest problem with it is that there's a complete lack of language to interrogate it, and that's a difficult conundrum to kind of unpick in many ways. But
how do you think we would fix that then?
um, philosophers, I think, like real talk, that's where words come from. Like
Okay,
you know, um, and I think partly philosophers, it's difficult in many ways because right now most of the kind of authors would be nice, and to be fair, there is some actually really good autistic books um, that are a lot more like nuanced around these topics. Um,
have you ever thought of writing, a book on this?
mm,
He's shaking. He's shaking his head vigorously. By the way, for
yeah.
everybody not looking.
Um,
Yeah, I just wondered.
it's yeah. I mean, I think the because I think far too much. Because I think the problem is that, again, far too much of the language is it's a weird thing saying that you believe in the double empathy problem, because, or theory, because in many ways, you know, you can spend 2 hours talking about it, and then like 3 sentences into the next conversation, you'll start using like very like, there is one empathy. Human beings have it, others don't. You know,
Yeah.
and then you just go straight back into this other form of language, which honestly ends up honestly making a complete mockery of the.
Yeah. I know we've just talked about it for over half an hour, but just as a reiteration, could you tell me again, in your own words, what you think it means, double empathy theory in practice?
In practice, well, that's a different question. I mean, in some ways, it's an interesting one because generally, empathy is something that essentially, as children, we are taught to kind of ration, and certainly our emotional energy. We are you know, we're taught that it should be stratified and rationed. I mean, basically, in groups and out groups are exactly that. I mean, no school argues that people shouldn't have, that there shouldn't be in groups and out groups, and yet actually that's basically teaching people to ration energy, which emotional energy, which in turn is basically exactly what, you know, that's a fair basis for racism, if I'm perfectly frank with you, or any form of ism. Like when you just go, well, that person, like, I haven't got like infinite emotional energy, so fuck it, I just won't use it on that group. Like, is that you know,
Yeah.
it's you know, there's you know, all of this is kind of just really dumb, and it
Yeah.
comes from the notion that there's only a certain amount of emotional energy, and in terms of actually talking about how we can use our emotional energy more wisely, and being honest about how we do use our emotional energy honestly, because to some degree one of the kind of dense issues here is that there is that essentially we're taught in a fairly capitalistic way to use our emotional energy just to use our emotional energy for the maximum gain.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's no theory there. So in the end, there's no point in discussing whether that's good or bad, because you can't, because there's no theory. You know, so there's no possible discussion to be had. But also, you're gonna, you know, in the end, you're gonna come out with some pretty, I'm gonna use a metaphor here, some pretty weird knots.
Yeah.
Basically, you're gonna come up with some pretty weird patterns, because if you, basically someone's empathy kind of derives from 0 to 18, then let's say they grow up have an all-white secondary school.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you know, some of them won't grow up to be racist. Some of them probably will.
Yeah.
So I don't. So honestly, this is so. And so in terms of practice, I think we have to actually reckon and discuss how we use our emotional energy and who we use it on, and actually actually be honest about that, and actually and to some degree actually like discuss how this has an impact on policy and on practice.
Yeah.
Again, this is part of the reason why there's almost no language around it, because again, you know, we don't actually, no one ever, people very rarely talk about how they use their emotional energy. They just do, and then complain when someone else like gets them to use their emotional energy in a way that they don't want to.
Do you think that using yourself as an example, do you think that you've found a good way that works for you in terms of using your emotional energy?
I mean, honestly, as an autistic person, emotional energy is like I don't have that much. I have very little, and so in some ways, it's what in terms of one of the great things, one of the most refined things you have to be really good at to be good at masking is emotional energy and husbanding it and marshalling it and how to regenerate it as quickly as possible in order to yada 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 yada. And so
Could you
honestly,
do,
in some ways
could,
that's I think that's the most significant biological and psychological difference between autistic people and neurotypicals. So again, I don't in some ways know what happens in neurotypicals heads in this. I
yeah,
know what happens in mine, but yeah, sorry.
could you, could you just quickly tell us what masking is again?
Masking is basically acting neurotypical. So basically, it is. So basically, the short answer is pretending. The long answer
Okay,
is essentially you use it. Essentially, you learn and use a whole series of neurotypical iconography in order
yeah.
to make them think that you're one of
I
them.
think we've done that before, but I think we should do another episode on it in the future. And I've
Mm-hmm.
just got what I know we're running out of time today, but I've just got one or two other quick questions
Yeah.
that I think I should ask. Is like one of them is like when you're hanging out with like autistic people, yeah. Do, do, do you do you find uh, how do you find that emotionally? Like, what I'm trying to say is it harder or easier to hang out with autistic people emotionally than neurotypical people?
Easier, partly because I don't have to worry about body language as much,
Okay.
almost always. Um, Partly also because I mean this somewhat varies depending on how. One of the slightly fascinating things is when you get an autistic person who's not used to hanging out with autistic people.
All right.
But yeah, that's an entire complication. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I find that much easier. I mean, obviously, some autistic people I get on with better than others, but
Yeah, but that's the same with everyone, though, isn't it?
yeah,
But
basically, that's just being literally human.
yeah, but I was just wondering whether it took far more energy to like hang out with neurotypicals, like.
Yeah, because
Uh,
honestly, there's a whole bunch of things like how close you are, which honestly, I've autistic people tend to have like one standard distance and they just stick to it.
like
Um,
like hanging out with me is that difficult in like an empathy like way
um,
apart from me being a dick, you know, that
um,
is another human thing, you know.
um, I mean, to some degree, neurotypicals are neurotypicals. So
Okay,
it's always one of those things that it's um
because I never, although I've had interactions with uh, autistic people before, you're my first long term relationship in terms of an autistic person. So it's a learning experience for me, you know. Uh, that's why I was wondering whether I've been doing things that I've just been annoying the tits out of you, other
um
than other than me being a dick, you know, just be just be being a proper neurotypical, which I don't think I am, by the way, but in terms of an autistic perspective, I'm looked upon as that, but I don't think I am. Um, is is there anything I could be doing better or?
um I mean, honestly, generally, um, the two, I think the two most significant things here is the difference between in one-on-one versus groups.
Yeah.
and I find that neurotypicals tend to like hanging out with groups of people, and I personally find that much more awkward.
All right.
And honestly, um, yeah. So honestly, I tend to so 98% of the time, it is a lot like mostly I like hanging out one to one with people. I genuinely, it's fine. I can work with it. When it comes to hanging out with like 10 people and then me have and that tends to be a lot harder and a lot more stressful, and I have to be a lot more kind of strategic and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, that tends to be a lot more of a thing. The other thing I would say in this is one of the more interesting foibles is around like having fun, because
Right.
like
Okay.
parties tend to parties tend to be really loud and there's lots of people at them,
Yeah.
and those things are bad.
Yeah.
um, so I
So
think I think so I think honestly, if we're talking about, so those aren't things specific to you really, but honestly I think in terms of things that are
no,
useful and
I was just
interesting.
you. I was just using myself
Yeah.
as a way to get out into the wider world, you know. But you do like hanging out at the pub, so how does that work?
um Depends on how many people.
Okay.
um I mean honestly um I mean, actually, I like drinking. So to some degree,
Yeah.
like just because you're like I may be autistic doesn't mean I don't like drinking. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that just neurotypicals think that they have a monopoly on, and it's just
And
like
how does this is probably a really naive, stupid question, but how does being drunk affect your autism?
um
Does it does
I
it
mean
less?
I mean one of the weirder things is that actually I find that it's generally not as much as you would I um like actually
Because
one of the at university, one of the things that I basically put myself through, which was basically kind of like SAS training in masking, is basically how to go out clubbing whilst autistic, which honestly it's basically got about 15 different horrendous things, where you have a combination of dancing, which involves very high levels of like body language and coordination and things,
yeah,
at the same time as having to spend like 8 hours straight with neurotypicals, at the same time as being in environments loud enough that basically I I I kid you not, my ears just stopped hearing stuff. Like within
really?
10 minutes of going into
Okay.
clubs, like I just like my brain just kind of go, yeah, there's not noise anymore. There's just like a constant. I'm basically just inside a giant's heart at this point.
Fucking
It
hell.
is,
That's horrible.
and
So,
honestly, that at the same time as that, just like the crowds of people and just everything, it is just a
so
torture chamber. And
sounds like a nightmare.
yeah, like I mean, I guess they could have knives and guns in the place, but honestly, there's not that many ways you could make it worse, if I'm perfectly
Yeah,
frank.
yeah, yeah.
So essentially, so when you come, so honestly, and I just basically went, I'm going to do this at least a couple of times in order to like learn how to do this properly. And basically, since university, I haven't even like thought about going back. There is
Yeah.
no part of my brain which wants to ever go clubbing in any universe. Like it's, I'm just, I don't know why. But pubs aren't nowhere near as bad as that. Like
Yeah,
in the end, like since the noise isn't terrible, like you
yeah,
actually have like a couple of square feet to yourself, so you don't
yeah,
actually have to touch people. Like they get weird when they get drunk, but still,
yeah.
um, etc. So
And on
yeah,
that note, I think
yeah,
we'll call it. But can
yes,
I just finish before we finish? Can I just say a big, big thank you to you, Pete, for sharing with us today? Because I realised that that must have been difficult for you. But honestly, I genuinely mean it. You've opened my mind anyway, and I'm sure you've done it millions of people around the world. So
I hope
thank
everyone
you.
enjoys it.
Bye
Right.
bye.
See ya. Bye.